Racial slavery was not only the backbone of the Southern economy, but it was also deeply ingrained in the social fabric in Southern life. One aspect that the anti-slavery writers noticed was that its impacts were so strong that the white children became easily conditioned to view themselves as superior to those of the brown-skinned people they called blacks, right? And so let's talk a little bit about this. And we're going to open up the book here. It's called Race in North America by Dr. Audrey Smedley. So let's go on here to page 190, where she writes this. The idea of race differences had become an instrumental part of American social structure, molding values and lifestyles. In other words, the racial concept was a very useful tool for creating a hierarchy within the society, with those labeled as whites at the top and those tagged as blacks at the very bottom in the pit, right? And with that being understood as the standard, the way that society viewed and treated each of these people could develop, right? Along with other lifestyles that reinforced the racial ideology, right? Every aspect of that system was designed specifically to reinforce that, right? That's what we have to understand. From the names of black and white people to the rights that they gave, the education, the job opportunities, and so on and so forth. They rigged the entirety of the society to support the idea that the whites are supposed to be at the top and the blacks are at the bottom, right? With everyone else falling somewhere in between, right? Let's understand that and let's keep reading. Southerners, including those who never owned slaves, saw race and racial differences as critical to their way of life, and they were much more comfortable when gross physical variations clearly delineated the status of free persons and slaves. And most of the whites didn't own slaves, so they didn't have any real economic benefit from that system. But what they did have were social benefits. And so for most of them, they found it wonderful living in a place where the people who didn't look like them occupied the lower rung on the social ladder, right? And I can see it right now. Ooh-wee, how they must have felt. Here we go. They came to see free blacks as an anomaly, a contradiction of their vision of what the natural state of things should be. Anti-slavery sentiments endangered their perception of what was essential to their culture, in part because of the very real economic changes abolition would entail, but also because it threatened to disrupt the status and power relationships to which many whites had become addicted. That's the getting high off of the white superiority complex, right? The need to see other people with a different skin complexion beneath a person in order to feel validated and some sense of supreme self-worth, right? And there's still many of the whites today who feel that way. Why? Because they have inherited that consciousness, right? And they have become addicted to the feeling that it produces. So today, some feel that as long as those who identify themselves as black continue doing things like sports, entertainment, rapping, and similar things that blacks are typically known to do, then it's not a problem. But as soon as they shift to the more weightier subjects and they're actually good at it, then it may feel threatening to the ones of them who are used to getting high off of the dying system of white supremacy. And so during the slave setting, the free blacks and the anti-slave writers, they would have been looked at as a threat, right? Because they implied a disruption to the system that the Southern whites were already addicted to, right? Let's understand and get some more. Unmitigated power permitted the whites' racial hostility and sense of superiority to flourish with impunity. It also allowed the fabrication of a vicious and devastating image of the Negro, which precluded the acceptance of blacks as potential equals. And who created the image of the Negro? It was the whites who imagined what the Negro was and who fine-tuned the frequency for how they imagined them acting and being, right? Which obviously Dr. Smedley knows. And I suspect that it's the reason why she repeatedly puts the Negro in quotations in much of her book, right? But let's keep going. There had always been some men and women, both in England and the colonies, who expressed varying degrees of opposition to slavery. So we know that every fair-skinned person of European descent did not support the system of slavery. And the sincere people were the ones who did not have a financial incentive attached to that system, right? And so we're talking about people who are not like Thomas Jefferson, who paid only lip service against the slave system, but in actuality, he owned hundreds of slaves. And even when he died, he still didn't set them free when he could have, right? And so we're talking about other genuine opposers to slavery who are in England and the other American colonies, right? So here we go. Many were merely uncomfortable with the idea of one human being having total, forcible control over another. Others accepted slavery and even recognized some basis for it in the Bible and the writings of the ancient Greeks and Romans, but they argued that the course of human history had advanced beyond such practices, which is to say that those practices were outdated and products of their time and no longer fitting for reference in a progressing society. Human progress in the future would be based on free labor, which would ultimately prove more productive. Free labor meaning people who are not bound by chains or some master for the purpose of working. They willingly work and are paid based upon that work, which is a free labor market which most of us in Western society live in today, with the exception of prison inmates who are essentially slaves. Such views were influenced by the ideology of capitalism and the growing urban and industrial development in the North that depended on free wage labor. Some critics of slavery recognized an implacable reality: the corrosive effect of slavery on white attitudes toward all blacks. Even Thomas Jefferson, in his painful ambivalence, wrote one of the most eloquent expressions of such sentiments. Now let's hear what he has to say.
The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, and degrading submissions on the other.
Which is to say that the way the master and the slave interact with each other involved the master being emotionally reckless and constantly bossing the slaves around, and the slaves doing whatever he's told while being humiliated in the process, right? Now pay attention and listen to this.
Our children see this and learn to imitate it, for man is an imitative animal.
That's the parent making a copy of themselves. The children were watching it, and those actions were molding their minds. And because they saw their parents and everyone else doing it, the children interpreted it as being normal and something that's okay to do, right? This is partly how consciousness reproduces itself in humans. Because you have to remember that the first slave owners in the American colonies in the early 1600s, they didn't live 200 years to keep the system going. Their ideology was passed on from generation to generation. And the human is like a vessel that holds these ideas, right, and acts them out. And so there was a lineage of human vehicles that acted as agents for those ideas, which passed on from parent to children, which is how a large part of culture is transmitted and kept alive, right? And so this is what Thomas Jefferson knew, and this is what he's breaking down. Now let's get some more.
This quality is the germ of all education in him.
What quality? The ability to imitate what they see. Jefferson is saying that this ability for children to copy what they see, this is the germ or the seed that starts all education in a child. Pay attention.
From his cradle to his grave, he is learning to do what he sees others do.
This is also going into the human herd mentality, where humans follow and repeat what others do, and often without question. Because like Jefferson said, the human is an imitative animal, right? And once the human learns a set of patterns of belief and behavior, then it's very difficult for them to break away from those, especially if everyone around them is believing and behaving the same way. Understand? And so that's why the environment and who you associate with is very important, because you start to imitate their way of thinking and also their way of behaving, right? Just like Jefferson is explaining with the children. Now let's keep going.
The parent storms, the child looks on, catches the lineaments of wrath, puts on the same airs in the circle of smaller slaves, gives a loose to his worst of passions, and thus, nursed, educated, and daily exercised in tyranny, cannot but be stamped by it with odious peculiarities.
He's saying that the child watches and copies the angry and wrathful behavior of the parents, and then applies this same behavior to the younger and weaker slaves. And the child being daily exposed to this type of environment, it's almost inevitable that the child is going to develop negative traits and habits, right? That's what he means.
The man must be a prodigy who can retain his manners and morals undepraved by such circumstances.
Or only the exceptionally rare person can be raised in this environment and retain proper manners and morals, right? Which goes to show how aware Jefferson was on the impacts of generational patterns of thinking and behavior. Because once a culture is solidified, then it's very difficult for the preceding generations to break away from it, right? And so there's many people out there who develop cultures and societies who clearly understand this line of thinking, right? From now all the way back into the past when civilization first started. So pay attention to the knowledge that Jefferson was bringing out because it gives some insight, right? Now let's move on. 30 years before Jefferson wrote these remarks, the great abolitionist John Woolman had observed how the
wrongful enslavement of Negroes depraves the mind.
Both Woolman and his fellow abolitionist Anthony Benezet decried how the minds of white children are conditioned to Negro inferiority. Watch this. The Negroes, Benezet noted in 1762,
are constantly employed in servile labor, and the abject condition in which we see them from our childhood has a natural tendency to create in us an idea of a superiority over them, which induces most people to look upon them as an ignorant and contemptible part of mankind.
You see that? This is the effect the colonists had in mind when they put all of those causes in place, using their speculative abilities, right? When they begin using the tool of law to strip rights away from the Negro and making it illegal for the master to free their slaves and doing public whippings and so forth, right? They created a society that was basically a large ritual that reinforced the idea that the blacks were the lowest rung in the society, right? And all of those symbols spoke to the unconscious aspect of the humans who were in that society, right? And many of them, they weren't even aware why they felt superior to the Negro, but they just did, right? There were not many outside of the well-educated who were conscious enough to know why they felt that way, like Benezet is explaining, especially not the poor whites, right? The only thing that they knew was that they were the white men and that they were supposed to be over the blacks, right? That's all they knew. How and why it got that way, that was not of their concern, right? But let's keep going. Woolman and Benezet were not alone in discovering the power of such conditioning and its corrupting effect on human relationships. Speaking about the fallacious reasoning and absurd sentiments used and entertained concerning Negroes, David Cooper declared,
"The low contempt with which they are generally treated by the whites lead children from the first dawn of reason to consider people with a black skin on a footing with domestic animals, formed to serve and obey."
This is similar to what Jefferson was breaking down. The children saw how the rest of the society viewed and treated people with brown skin, and since everyone else treated them like cows and dogs who were just supposed to listen and obey, the children began copying that behavior. Thus the cycle continueth. A population so humiliated and degraded, overworked, sweat-drenched and filthy most of the time, and totally deprived of any form of self-esteem, could hardly have met the requirements of civilized appearance and comportment. Those whose perverse reasoning denied the effects of the slave situation and environment on blacks could accept with equanimity the equally perverse belief that such behavior and appearance were natural to all those with black skins. Those were the people who denied the environmental factors, and those were the ones who could align with the idea that it was principally a genetic or a natural cause which dictated their behavior, right? And this is important because it really boils down to those two approaches. If it were a genetic thing, then a lot of Negroes were in trouble, right? Because there's nothing that could be done to fix a genetic issue, especially if it's deeply hardwired. So the thinking along those lines was, since they were naturally that way and they couldn't develop any further, then just keep them there in the slave pits, right? So they can labor and they could make profits for the owners. But if it was not natural or genetic and it was environmental, which ties into cultural, then that behavior could be modified if it were cultivated in the right environment and given the right examples to follow, right? And the thinking along this line could be, why are you holding people back who are just as human as you are and just as capable as anyone else, right? What gives you the right to keep people in the pit, right? And other arguments along this line could be made, right, from an ethical position, right? So this is what they were dealing with. Now let's keep going. Despite such critics, during the long decades when the institution was being solidified, few voices opposed slavery, although some men like Morgan Godwin were critical of the greed and materialism of slave owners. In the 18th century, the moral problems inherent in slavery became more acute, with anti-slavery sentiment emerging out of what Davis sees as a new ethic of benevolence. This was an era of rising humanitarian concerns, of revolutionary ideas about human nature as rational and/or governed by natural laws, the application of which would lead to improvement of the human condition. As Europeans were reconceptualizing the functions and limits of government and ruminating on the nature of life, liberty, economics, and politics, they speculated on the equally critical meaning of Christian living. Sensitivity, compassion, the expansion of moral feelings, and the idea of public duty appeared as common topics of sermons and written literature, providing a fertilizing milieu for anti-slavery thought. So the cosmic energy began to shift, which caused the seeds of a new consciousness to be planted during that era, right? And the evolution of consciousness has been continuously happening throughout human existence and throughout life in general, right? Because the one thing we know from experience is that nothing stays the same, right? Nothing remains permanent. All things change and evolve. And so hopefully you have found this video valuable. I want to thank you right now for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.